I want to welcome Gareth, and it's a real pleasure to have him from the UK. This is the world of Zoom allows us to do this kind of stuff. And he is at the University of Manchester as a lecturer there and ministry at Cliff College, UK, working in the area of family ministry. So just in terms of the formalities, what I ask is for those that are joining in or are in right now, just to keep your mic on mute at the moment. What we tend to do is we'll let Gareth sort of take over and share what he has. If you do have any questions, either to write them down or even stick them in the chat, that we could actually come back to once he's, rather than stopping his flow. And once he's finished, we can kind of talk back and forward and ask questions and see where we go from there. It's a very topical issue about families. I know that you've just finished a PhD in the area of families, and whatever you have to share with us will be valuable, and then we'll kind of go from there. So I'll let Gareth take over.
Great. Thank you so much, Tammy. It's a great pleasure to be here with you guys, and just like-minded people across a great distance. But it's great to be able to, through this great technology that we're all getting so used to now, just share with you some of what I've been thinking about in the last few years. I haven't quite finished my PhD, Tammy. So yeah, I'm very close now. I'm supposed to be submitting this summer, and God willing, I'll manage that. But it's in the area of family ministry, and I'm going to just sketch out some definitions and things before we get started, so we all know exactly what we're talking about. So when I began my PhD, I was actually in ministry in a church as a family minister, and wondering why a family ministry was so hard. But family ministry for me meant two things. It meant the biological legal home, which is what we normally mean by family ministry, but it also meant the church family. So that's when we start talking about intergenerational church matters as well. And actually over the years, the thing that's really started to become my area of interest has been the nexus between the two. So the point at which the family, biological legal home, and the church family, so intergenerational church matters, when they kind of like coincide and how they relate to each other. And that's really where I've been writing and researching in the last 5 years. And that's part of what I'll be presenting today. Initially, my focus will be on intergenerational matters, but then they'll turn to biological legal home as well. And my PhD thesis title, the working title, if you like, is what are the impediments and encouragements to family ministry, meant in those in a twin sense, both of those terms, in a selection of Church of England churches. So my research is focused on 3 case studies from Church of England churches here in England. So it's qualitative research, so it's not quantitative stats, mass research in that sense, but it is deep and rich in the kind of qualitative sense. So I've gone into great depth in 3 case studies rather than skated across the top of lots and lots of different people. And if you're interested in it, just in case you are interested in this sort of thing, I mean, that what I will just quickly show is my that's my hold on a minute. Right, here we go. So that's my kind of my research methods. If you're interested in that sort of thing, then you can ask me more about that. But basically, going from left to right, I'm just familiarizing myself with the case studies. And then I'm doing semi-structured interviews with youth, children, parents, church leaders, vicars, youth workers, children's workers, family workers, whoever's there. So I can get a picture of the whole case. I used photos to elicit good responses to my questions. I then asked them to keep a diary for a month, and then I came back and did some more semi-structured interviews on their diaries. And that's how I came up with my data. I was basically looking for, I didn't ask them directly what stops you ministering along the lines of the church family or biological legal family. I asked more indirect questions than that. But that was effectively what I was doing. And let me just give you a flavour also of the case studies, just so you know the sorts of churches I'm talking about. So there's my three names of the churches, obviously made up. And down the left side there, you can see the type of church I was looking at, and whether it was united or divided, which is quite important for me, what sort of leaders they had, the size of church, the socioeconomic background, the ethnic mix, and the type of building, which I put there because it became important. So the type of church, a new wine is kind of a charismatic movement in the UK here. So the first church I looked at was like that, a very united church around that idea. The vicar was a visionary gregarious leader, about 200 in size, a mixed suburban white church with a very classically Victorian building in the UK here, which means a big kind of, well, I don't know how to describe it, I'm not an architect, but a big Victorian barn of a building. I then looked at a mixed economy church. So by that I mean they had three different kind of congregations which operated fairly independently. Very divided church for that reason, often go hand in hand. So you had a kind of very, very old kind of choir-led sort of service with the only children were in the choir. And then you had a kind of fresh expressions, kind of family, new kind of initiative, and then a third congregation as well. The vicar's a quiet delegator there, but a similar sort of size, very, very wealthy though, and mostly white. My last church was what I've called a generous Orthodox church. I don't know if that means much down with you guys, but for us that means around the creeds there's unity, but other than that there's diversity, but happily so. It was a very united church around that idea. So you would have people who are quite liberal, people who are quite evangelical, but all happy with, by and large, being with each other. It was a much smaller church. It was a church of 100, and it was in a very deprived area. That's what UPA means in this country. A very, very deprived area, very mixed ethnically. And importantly, it was a building that was very mixed in the round. So it was a 1970s building. And instead of kind of like a typical Anglican church where the front really meant the front and you're way, way back, this was much more in a kind of horseshoe circle, half circle idea. So even when you're at the front, you're almost in the middle, which suited the vicar down to the ground. He loved that. So what I'm looking here in my approach was opportunities to learn. So I wasn't trying to cover all the different types of churches. I wasn't looking specifically for one particular thing or another. I was just looking for different types of churches so I could layer my learning, and layering also meant for me that I was just going along changing my questions if I wanted to, because I'd learned something from the previous case study. So for those that are interested in methodological questions, there endeth the lesson. Those that were a bit bored by that, don't worry, that's it now. We'll move on to my three main findings. So don't forget, my main question is what's stopping and what's encouraging family ministry, and by that I mean ministering to little Johnny or little Susie in the context of their home environment, or the context of the wider church family. Okay, so we're quite good at doing youth groups and children's clubs, but what's stopping us or what's encouraging us ministering and doing mission in the context of the home, biological legal home, or the wider church family? And I had three findings, and I'm only going to talk about one today because it's the one that I've most developed, and that is the top left one, which I've named ludicity. I'll come on to what that means in a minute. My other two are relational safety, that's the image at the bottom, and then leadership, which is my image to the right there. So I've got ludicity and relational safety and leadership. So I appreciate you don't necessarily want to see the PowerPoint the whole time, Tammy, so I'll come off that in just a second. I'll just whiz through these so I can get to that. So ludicity, for those that know their Latin, means playfulness. But I didn't want to use the word play or playfulness because that just normally conjures up images of building blocks or jigsaws, and specifically children, but I wanted to get away from that. So following Huizinga's definition, and obviously he's, when it comes to play theorists, he's one of the big ones, but he uses this great definition of ludicity, or the ludus, which is a voluntary activity or occupation executed within certain fixed limits of time and place, according to rules freely accepted but absolutely binding, having its aim in itself and accompanied by a feeling of tension, joy, and the consciousness that it is different from ordinary life. So what I ended up finding when I looked at my case studies was that where ludicity was present, then intergenerational relationships, so family ministry from a church family perspective was present. So the more ludic a church, the more fertile the ground was for intergenerational ministry, where ludic means what Huizinga means it here. What I'm going to do now is just go through the findings, the data from my case studies, and demonstrate where ludicity comes up in that and why it's so important for those intergenerational relationships. Let's not worry too much about that. I'll come out of this just for a minute. Stop sharing. There we go. Am I back now? You can see me full. Great. So when I was looking through my case studies, no one started talking about ludicity. Obviously, you wouldn't expect anyone to do that. But equally, hardly anyone talked about play or playfulness. But when you look at Huizinga's definition, there were lots of things that people talked about which fit that definition absolutely spot on. And those were things like participation and freedom, fun, authenticity, and informality. So I took those and started playing around with those, pardon the pun, and started thinking, in what ways do these feed ludicity? What's the relationship between these things and ludicity? Because I want to track that through to then intergenerational relationships. I found that authenticity and fun tended to be secondary things. I don't mean in importance, but what I meant was they didn't start there. If you like, the root tended to first and foremost be participation, informality, and freedom. So where people were fostering freedom, informality, and participation in church life, they were fostering authentic relationships and fostering fun, joyous relationships, which fostered IG, intergenerational relationships. So I was looking at those three really, and I was looking at informality, I was looking at participation, and I was looking at freedom. And I wanted to know, well, what brings those about? What fosters them? What's the fertile ground for those? So you see what I'm doing is every time I find something, I'm then digging underneath to say, well, what means that is present and what stops it being present? I'll just go back to my PowerPoint because there's a few quotes I just wanted to read off. So here we go. A few quotes that demonstrate here we go, the importance of things like freedom. So there's my picture for freedom. So this is a little girl called Millie, and she said, when I said, oh yeah, how do you best understand who Jesus is? She was talking about freedom, and she's talked about music festivals. And she was saying, well, with music at festivals, they can sort of be free and a lot louder than they can be in churches, because there's normally bigger open spaces. You can just be as free as you like. You express yourself in any way you like. So that's just one example of how freedom was very important for the youth and children in the churches in terms of understanding who Jesus was, their faith development, their discipleship. Or as another example, Henry, who was the vicar, he said that's the youth and children, they're with their church family playing, and no one was telling them to stop, and they felt this is an environment where I can be myself, I can play and push, and that's okay. So that's what I kind of meant by free. He was talking about how freedom was really important, gave loads of different examples, both within services but also in other informal events. And there I put in bold where I can be myself, because that's the link to authenticity that I mentioned. So I was finding that actually that was something, a byproduct, if you like. So as important, but a byproduct of freedom. Where there's freedom, then it's not the only reason you get authenticity, but it's a constituent ingredient of bringing authentic relationships about. So participation, just a few more quotes. I'll stay on the PowerPoint just because I've got a few quotes here from my research. So Here's Wendy, who was doing lots and lots of work with children, and she's sort of always zeroed in on how important participation was. So almost every single child, as part of their answers, said we love the games. They helped us understand more about God, and they are silly games, but they always have a meaning. And that was for under 11s. But then Sally, who was a teenager, talked about participation being absolutely vital, but in terms of questions rather than silly games. So here was her quote: "You're happy to sort of go, I don't understand what that means, or I don't agree with you, sort of idea. And you know, you're not going to get stamped on you're sort of wrong." So it's very important for Sally and her friends that they could participate through actually asking questions, and have the room and the space to do that. And that was their understanding of participation, but it also bled into this idea of ownership. So if they could participate, they could do things, they could be treated like adults, which is Danielle was a teenage girl, and she zeroed in on that idea, be it playing music in a service or whatever, but they very much zeroed in on this idea of participation at several levels. Informality, do excuse my picture there, that's the shorts on the right are supposed to be the informal dress. So Carrie was saying she was a children's leader and parent, and she said it's just much harder for children to connect and understand if it's very formal, because the world's no longer as formal as it was in the Victorian era. It becomes very alien to them. And then really interestingly is Nina, who was a woman in her late 20s, but was very, very big on choral music and sung in the choir in the mixed economy church that I mentioned. She acknowledged she desperately wanted children to come into, proper church as she saw it, but recognized how hard that was because of the space that they were occupying. So she said, I wouldn't say you could necessarily going to Chester Cathedral or Canterbury Cathedral and blast out Matt Redman, but you sing a piece of Palestrina. I think I've pronounced that right. Sorry if I haven't, I'm not a classical musician. And it just fits and works and it fills the space. So she recognized that there's a link between aesthetics and cultural expressions of worship, which was a problem for her. So just whizzing through where I've got to then is if one of the roots of IG is ludicity, if you follow my picture there, and three of the roots of ludicity are freedom, participation, informality, which is what I've just been talking about for my research. Then for me, the question became, what is it in each case study that encourages or impedes freedom, participation, and informality of the youth and children's involvement in their biological legal families and their church family? So basically I'm saying, if I can find out what fosters freedom, participation, informality, then I can find out what fosters ludicity, then I can find out what fosters IG, and we'll come on to family ministry in just a second. So that's really became then the focus, and really started then a period of theological reflection, both on the first and foremost my data that arose from the research, but then also onto the literature. So what I started doing first and foremost was picking up on the importance of charismatic theology. So all three of the churches were either charismatic or were open to charismatic theology. So even the generously Orthodox Church, their young people went off to Soul Survivor, which in the UK is a very big youth movement, which has now just stopped really, but was very big for many years. And so all three were open, either definably identified as charismatic churches or open to it. And on reflection, when I started looking at charismatic theology, I started seeing all sorts of links with ludicity in terms of freedom, participation, and informality. And just reflecting on Pentecostal and charismatic writers, I was really struck by the, if you like, the coherence of the theology to not in every aspect, obviously, and there are some important ways in which charismatic theology doesn't provide fertile ground for IG. But Warrington, Keith Warrington's somebody I was drawing on in terms of Pentecostal and charismatic theology. yeah, talking here in terms of freedom, talking about a readiness to discard plans for which the Spirit may wish to introduce that has not been anticipated. So here the idea that in charismatic worship, you've got that idea of freedom. You've got that idea that we're not stuck to a liturgy. If somebody's got something to say or someone's got something that they want to do, then it's possible to do it. Now, of course, in the big grandstanding, big charismatic churches, that's definitely not always the case, and we may have already experienced that. But certainly at root in concept, charismatic worship has that kind of readiness to discard plans and move with the Spirit. In terms of participation, Warrington calls charismatic theology a democratizing force in life and practices. So because everyone has the Spirit, in charismatic theology, it's not the clergy who then, therefore, if you like, are the mouthpiece. It's actually up to others in the pew, although most charismatic churches don't have pews, of course, to say what the Spirit is saying. And so there's the democratization. So participation becomes very something that's possible, and there's fertile ground there for that, which is again something which is important for ludicity. Jacques Sermont, writing back in the 90s, talks about there's a possibility of reacting with approval, applause, laughter, exclamation, or lament, or at other moments the response can be prayer, praise and glossolaic sound, a dance, a prophecy, a testimony, a song, or a text from scripture, but very much a participative idea. And then in terms of informality, just drawing the line between all that I've mentioned so far and the obvious conclusion that these things are going to be less formal than they would be otherwise. Not to say they'll be completely informal, they won't necessarily be chaotic, but of course from some of the epistles, 1 Corinthians especially, we know that they can be, but there is a tendency towards informality built into charismatic theology. So yeah, I mean, a great quote from Jacques Sermon to round it off in terms of the importance of charismatic theology on practice. How like a game charismatic celebration is, charismatic practice has an element of play in them, which was Sermon's conclusion from his book, Word and Spirit at Play. So charismatic theology, it was a real light bulb moment when I saw the link between the two of those things. The last thing I wanted to share was the link between the theology of Jürgen Moltmann and IG. Now, a word on Moltmann and a word on me at this point. So Jürgen Moltmann obviously is not a charismatic theologian or a Pentecostal theologian, and he has had run-ins with the Pentecostal movement, and yet there are very significant overlaps and similarities between the theologies, which are very important to think about at this point. The reason I zeroed in on him was that his name was explicitly mentioned in 2 of the 3 case studies that I looked at. The vicars in 2 of the case studies said that he was especially important and influential in their theological thinking. Now, I'm going to say all sorts of things about Moltmann now in terms of how he is also, like charismatic theology, provides fertile ground for IG. I myself am not, I'm not quite sure what the adjective Moltmanian. I don't subscribe to a lot of his theology, but what I'm doing here is looking at how important it is for IG rather than an assessment, if you like, a systematic assessment of his theology. So I'm not in any way saying his theology is good or bad per se. I'm just saying, oh, look at the links with IG here, aren't they interesting? So I won't go into detail into all of his theology and how it impacts IG, but for those with even just a passing understanding of Moltmann will know that he places great stress on social Trinitarianism rather than hierarchical Trinitarianism, and he places great stress on the freedom of the Spirit in creation and the way in which the Spirit of creation brings creation into the Trinity, so the Trinity is impacted, not in a pantheistic way, although it does sometimes start sounding like that, but in a way in which the Trinity is not left unaffected by creation. And Alongside that, a focus on creation, not simply as an act and a work, but creation as something that has a direction of travel, which is obviously basic biblical theology, but he stresses it very significantly, which is the link to the new creation and the Sabbath rest. So for him, creation becomes all about the new creation. So creation becomes a playground which demonstrates the new creation. So just flipping back to my PowerPoint so I can demonstrate where have we gone? So we can demonstrate some of that with some quotes from Moltmann, which would hopefully elucidate things. So just whizzing through there, the Trinity is social. So this was a reaction to Barth. Well, pretty much everything that Moltmann does is a reaction to Barth, but also the Western tradition as a whole, where he's reacting to the idea that
we seem to have lost him, which seems a little bizarre.
Okay, I think I'm back.
We lost you for a minute there.
Okay, I'm back. Am I okay? Am I here?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, right, we'll whiz on. So instead of focusing on the individual members of the Trinity as substance, he focuses on relationship. So that's what's important for him. So the Trinity is social rather than hierarchical, because it's all about the relationships. And secondarily, it's also about the dynamism of the Spirit bringing creation into the Trinity. And so quite importantly at this point, and I'll put a quote in here somewhere, Moltmann says this: in the perichoresis, which is the dance of the Trinity, of the relationships between them, the very thing that divides them, which is the personhood of the three, that's me putting that in there for clarity, becomes the thing that binds them together, because they're relationships of the persons. So historically, you may think, oh, the thing that divides me from you is my personhood. But he's saying, well, actually, it's not, because in the relationship, it binds us together. So he kind of turns that on its head, if you like, and we'll see how important that is for IG, or you can already see that, but we'll spell that out in detail soon. And then this idea of Sabbath rest, and a quote there from Moltmann: creation has the character of play, which gives God delight and human beings joy. So it's not about the get this right. It's not about the 6 days of work of creation. It's about the 7th day of Sabbath rest, which is celebration and joy. Hold on a minute, too far. Now, just shortcutting this, basically what Moltmann is doing is he wants to get away from this idea of a hierarchical Trinity, which is, if you like, has a word-based pneumatology. So the Spirit is bound to the Son, if you like, because of the Father sends the Spirit, the Son, the Father sends the Spirit. Instead of that, and instead of a distant sovereign God, instead of that, you get this kind of social Trinitarian approach, which has God very much involved in his creation, and a Spirit that's very free. And because of that, instead of what he calls a hierarchical constitution of the church, instead of getting that, you get that's on the top left. That's what he's wanting to get away from. And he does see a direct link between your theology and your practice. So he wants to get away from the Western tradition, which has legitimated hierarchical constitutions of the church, to the bottom and right quotes there. So he wants to get to a community in which everyone contributes what is his or hers. That's a non-hierarchical fellowship of equals in the Holy Spirit. And can I move that? Yes. Authority and obedience are replaced by dialogue, consensus, and harmony. And as soon as I say that, if you know anything about IG, you kind of go, oh, that sounds very familiar to me. It sounds like somebody writing in IG. And he never really wrote very much at all about this sort of thing, or there are little hints to it, which I won't go into now. But yeah, here's another, just 2 quotes to conclude before I stop. But here he has really interesting, sort of solidifying his argument with respect to IG, and not his argument, my argument, sorry. Individuals can see that the other person is no longer the limitation of my freedom. He or she is an expansion of it. So he's saying exactly what happens with the Trinity happens with your practice, such that in mutual participation in life, individual people become free beyond the limits of their individuality. So again, saying your theology impacts your practice in that sense of actually individuals become not boundaries, but they become possibilities. So I'll just wanted to end on this one because this comes from his book called The Theology of Play, which was then renamed of ludicity. So you can tell Moltmann's theology is really important for that concept of ludicity. So before finishing, that's my finishing Moltmann there. Before concluding, I just wanted to say what about family ministry in terms of the home, because I've spoken a lot about IG, but you might be left thinking, well, what about the home? How does ludicity, how does the research that I've been doing demonstrate a link to the home? Well, first and foremost, what I found really interesting was that it kind of did this firstly, that a lot of the IG that I was experiencing and seeing in my research was crowding out a focus on the biological, legal home family. And that was quite strong in at least, well, certainly one of the case studies. It was very, very strong, but it was also obvious in the other two as well. It's easy to see when people like Alan Harkness, I don't know if you've read any of Alan's work on IG, say things like this in terms of what IG is about. IG models, he puts against family ministry models versus them. So models which focus on family units rather than commencing with the congregational unit often fail to take sufficient cognizance of the reality in many contemporary congregations, which comprise a wide range of people for whom a family model of church may be unhelpful. And this was picked up on, especially one of the case studies that I was looking at, where they felt actually it is a versus, and again, this isn't me saying this is right or wrong, this is my observations. It is a versus, and we want to hold on to the importance and primacy of the church family over and above the biological legal home family, which I don't agree with. And I've written a separate piece in my thesis on that. But that is certainly what was coming through in my case studies in terms of the view of how the two fit together, which some IG writers like Alan obviously agree with, or at least he did back in 20 years ago. So what I found was that ludicity can aid family ministry when it comes to parental experiences of wider church gatherings, but it's less helpful, at least directly, with family ministry in the home. So what I mean by that is, if you've got a very ludic church, one that's focusing on participation and freedom and informality, then if you are a parent with children in that environment, then that's really great. That's really supportive, because you're not trying to keep them still. It's not a formal environment. They're participating, they're feeling free, and all those things that I was talking about earlier on. So ludicity helps family ministry at that point. But that seemed to me in my research as far as it went. And when we're talking about family ministry in the home, in the case studies I had, that was less obvious. It was much more likely to be a negative view at that point. And interestingly, when you look at family ministry people who have a very different view of the Trinity and creation and the Spirit, they do actually write the polar opposite to what people like Alan Harkness write. So here's Bruce Ware, who has written a chapter in a book on family ministry called Trained in the Fear of God by Randy Stinson, I think his name is. And he wrote a piece, Bruce Ware is a systematic theologian, and he wrote a piece on the Trinity and family ministry, and literally says the opposite of Moltmann, although they never engage with each other, which is a great shame. But the Trinity provides us a model in which we understand the members of a family as fully equal in their value and dignity as human beings made in God's image. Yet each member has a distinct role and relationship with the family. These roles and relationships are worked out within an authority submission structure that God designed as purposely reflective of God himself. So you can see this is an almost polar opposite view to Moltmann. This is actually in terms of my own upbringing and background, I'm much more Reformed evangelical, and I would come from a background as Bruce Ware does. And hence you can see why family ministry historically has come from a much more conservative evangelical background, with people like Bruce Ware writing this sort of thing, whereas IG is finding much more traction amongst less conservative constituencies for those reasons. Sometimes it can feel a little bit like this. Are you going to go one way or the other? Are you going to go into general family ministry? I appreciate there are a lot of people who've tried to tread a middle path, some more successfully than others. But I think for a lot of people who are writing in IT and family ministry, they don't successfully do that, and they've one way or the other, depending on their theology. I've spoken for quite long enough, so I'm going to be quiet now. And I'd love to hear your feedback. I'd love to hear your questions. I'd appreciate your engagement as we think about these things more. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. So much to think about, and some excellent stuff there to kind of munch on. It says where anyone can kind of unmute and ask a question. Feel free to do that. Or a clarification, or
so Gareth, a question. It's Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Thank you. This is very helpful. The question is, you have correctly said that it's not a competition between the primacy of the home or the primacy of the church. Both have a strategic complementary role in human formation and in relational development, etc., etc. So I'm just wondering, from where you sit, from where I sit down here, I think that the church has taken on the primary responsibility at the expense of empowering homes to own their level of that responsibility. So, what's your read on the radar of the complementary roles of the local faith community and local homes? And the bigger question is, how can a local faith community empower local homes, households, more in their God-given primary role of helping find life? So, does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, so we could, loads to say on that. It's a great question, Terry. Thank you. And it is one of the questions that set me onto the PhD in the first place. And I started out focusing on the home, ended up moving into IG when I realized the two were connected. And I've spent more time now thinking about IG than I have the home. If you want my thoughts more fully at a theological level, there's a book out by Corey Seibel. Do you know? So some of you guys might know Corey, and he wrote The Generative Church, which came out.
Yes.
And I put a chapter in there on the church-home relationship, which starts with really trying to ground the relation, the way we conceive that relationship in two things. One is a kind of fully orbed biblical theology, so taking into account the journey between creation to new creation. But secondly, also the dynamic nature of youth and children. So, because one of the problems is that people write from the perspective of children or youth, and they don't often take into account, obviously, that children become young people. So it's normally a static view from a perspective of either children's ministry or youth ministry. Whereas if we take into account the dynamism, then I think it changes the picture. So what I argue for is that because of those two things, I argue for a move from primacy of biological legal family through to church family, which traces the arc of biblical theology and also accounts for the dynamic nature of changing relationships with age. So that's what I do in essence in that chapter, and I think I'm persuaded that that's a good thing. I think that the practical considerations are really interesting. I think that part of it is convincing people of a theological position. The way my practical theology would work is I would want to convince people theologically of something before just jumping to practice. Of course, most people in churches just want they want to know the answer. They don't want to think through the theology, but I think it is important to lead people through that. But then I think it does also then beg bigger questions about the way that leadership functions. So this is the piece that I haven't really grappled with in my thesis yet, which is the extent to which leadership seems to make such a huge difference in these things, both the character of the leader, their stage, their background, but also their theology as well. And so I think those things have to be dealt with. I don't know what it's like in your churches, but the ones I'm dealing with, vicars are basically all powerful. They can pretty much do what they like. And a lot of them do. Or at least even if they're not dictatorial, churches tend to end up looking like them in the same way that dogs and owners look like each other in the end.
No, Gareth, down here, all pastors, we're totally democratic in all our churches. Pastors have very limited leadership. And so, yeah, come on down. And
I'd love to. When lockdown's lifted, I'll come and join you then. It sounds great.
Just on that leadership point, Gareth, sorry, just to follow up.
So like, for example, and I do think it does come down to this question of, in part, sometimes the vicar's view of the church, and also what is in their power. So what was really interesting is it literally was, so for one of them, it was very much, he was a real, lovely guy. We weren't theologically on the same page, or politically. He was very left-wing, quite liberal theologically, and he was an absolutely lovely guy. And his overriding, he was full of compassion. And everything was about equality of access. Everything had to be about equality of access. So instantly, as soon as you start talking about families as biological legal families, it was problematic for him, because he knew that when he sent some kids home, they went to one sort of family, and other kids, when he sent them home, they went to another sort of family. And so that was a big problem for him, because he was all about equality of access. So he thought, if I model our church, if I shape our church ministry around equipping parents or getting into homes and helping homes, that's going to be a big problem, because I know that that's going to work differently in different homes, and some children will be disadvantaged. But if I focus on the church family, then I can create a level playing field, because I can control that bit. So that was for one of them. But then one of the other vicars, he was actually, it was a similar thing in the sense that it was about control, but it wasn't about equality of access, because he wasn't as liberal or left wing or anything like that. But he was very much saying, basically, I can only control what I can control. And these middle class parents, because it's a much more middle class area, this one, they'll do what they want to do. And I can't control that, but I have power over the church. I can decide what goes on in the church. So I'm going to concern myself with the thing that I can do, because I have power over it. I'm not going to concern myself with the thing that basically is going to mean I'm going to bang my head against a brick wall, because I can only influence and try to persuade people who don't really want to do it, frankly. And it's embarrassing. It's something that's what's the word? I can't remember the words that he used. Not just embarrassing, but controversial as well. And also, then they become personal issues for the person who's opening their mouth, because it seems to be you're saying, "Oh, I'll tell you how to do it. I've got it all sorted," and no one wanted to do that. So Terry, I don't know. I mean, what's been your? Well, you can either reflect on what I've said, or you can share your experience.
I think two of the biggest barriers in terms of moving towards family-based ministry, which is participatory and ludicrous. Was that your word? Ludicrous? Something like
Well,
that.
ludicrous is a word that comes from ludicity, but yeah,
Yes,
ludicity, playfulness,
wonderful.
yeah.
Yes, that there is you've got this long history of traditional expression of church and faith community, driven by the leaders, as you've said. So trying to bring that into tradition is a challenge for many, trying to broker IG and family. And the other big trend is this is the big church that comes from a country across the Pacific from us, which I won't name, but this big church model where it's all about the performance and the weekend gathering is a pivotal event. And often there's not a lot of freedom within that, because I know our churches buy into that model, and it's a very tight, slick, well-run program. And yes, and so working in that context of traditional as well as this new modern trend of the big is the best, and the program and the slick are challenges for an intergenerational expression of faith. So that's a reading.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about the big gathering thing. I mean, interestingly, in one of the churches, the young people all went off to another church for a big gathering type event. But interestingly, they didn't see it as their church. They just saw it as an event, although it was a church service. And they maintained their relationship with this smaller church, which only had 100 people in it, because they had got those relationships there already, and they saw it as much more authentic, actually, in terms of them being them in that community.
Wow, some awesome stuff. Again, just keep saying things that make me want to go in a million different directions. Anyone else want to bring something up or ask a question? For me, one of the things, if I bring it back to kind of, I suppose, a practical, an earthy level for right now, I mean, certainly the stuff about, the playfulness, and really fascinated about, where you land with relational safety and leadership and all that. But the playfulness and the participation, freedom and informality, again, because Barna's research really brought a lot of that out within healthy, vibrant households where playfulness and children were present. And I kind of think now we're in this interesting space where families are now having to stay together, and I would imagine that those families that have these kind of elements will probably do a little bit better in these next few months than those that have the kind of rigidity, authoritarian, and without that kind of fun and freedom, which I think would be really, so to me, I think, I can imagine that's something that's really helpful for children's workers or people that are trying to help family workers and pastors go, how are you going to help your family?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Tammy. And there's a million things we could say on all of that. But I think when you were just speaking there, it struck me that you've got those three types of kind of approach to parenting, haven't you? You've got the kind of permissive parenting, you've got the authoritarian parenting, and then in the middle you've got the authoritative parenting, which is obviously the healthy way to go. And I think ludicity fits in that mold because it's got the freedom within it, but when you think about playfulness, it isn't chaos, and so it's not permissive in that kind of open sense, because of course we all know that when we play a game, if people don't abide by the rules, it doesn't work. So I think you're right that at this time in lockdown, it is ever more important that we strike that balance between the authoritarian and the permissive in parenting. And counsel people to be authoritative, and so say, look, this isn't chaos, but there is playfulness and play in it. I mean, it is interesting when you start thinking of the word play and how it's used in all sorts of different ways. So this is where I hope it's used like this in Australia. But if I have a bit of wood and I try to bend it, we say it's got a bit of play in it. as in it actually moves. And if it doesn't move, we say it has no play in it. So I think it is that kind of idea that, you know, we need families that have a bit of play in them, in that sense, not just, oh, I'm willing to get down the floor and build bricks with my son or daughter or whatever, but actually there's a bit of play in this. You know, it's not chaos, but there is a bit of movement and give. Yeah, so.
It's great. It's really good, really helpful. Any other comments or questions?
Just a brief comment, Gareth, in terms of you gave two very helpful definitions of family, but in the Western secular context, people want to debate the word family and what it means. So do you, in terms of an understanding of what family is, has that come into play in terms of there's so many different household shapes today? So.
Yeah, no, so it's not really a focus of my my work. So when I'm thinking about ministry to families, I'm literally talking about the people who are in legal. That's why I say legal biological families, I think is my phrase. It's those who are legally responsible for the youth and children. So I don't attempt to define family units for the purposes of my thesis. I don't need to, so I don't do it. You know, you don't do what you don't need to do, obviously. Yeah, so for me, it's literally, yeah, if you're going to get a consent form signed, who's signing it, kind of thing. In this country, it's got to be the people who are in parental authority, and they may be foster parents, they may be adopted parents, they may be, or step parents, all sorts. So I kind of sidestep that, to be honest, Terry.
It's very wise, I think. If you want to try and define family, you'd need to do a thesis, I think.
Indeed.
Cool. Can you in a couple of sentences or kind of give a bit more information to what you see as the relational safety piece?
That's the bit I'm wrestling with at the moment, and essentially I think that it basically it fits into ludicity, as I think the way I'm thinking about it at the moment. I need to get I might have it right here in front of me. To be honest, I was literally just about to kind of crack it, and then we all got locked down, and I had to do all my lectures online and everything, and it all got a bit chaotic. But basically, so what I'm looking for in my thesis is what I've called relationally positioned practices. So what are the practices that bind relationships, and what are the things that underlie those? So freedom, participation, informality are things that underlie relationally positioned practices that aid IG and family ministry. And I think relational safety is one of those things. If we talk about trust, I think it is what I start to call, there's an article that I draw on that talks about enabling and social preconditions for relationally positioned practices. And I think that things like freedom, participation, informality are necessary preconditions or enabling conditions. And I think that relational safety functions in the same way. So it's an enabling condition. It's a social precondition for relationally positioned practices. And so I might use the word trust instead. And it's that idea being that you might have freedom, participation, informality, but if you're missing the trust element, then you're going to struggle, because that's actually absolutely essential for participation and informality to actually flourish into positive intergenerational relationships. So I haven't bottomed that out yet, but and I think there's a whole suite at that point. Like I used charismatic theology and Moltmann to say these are things that provide fertile ground for freedom, participation, informality. I think there are a whole other suite of things which provide fertile ground for relational security, and I mean theologically speaking as well. So when I look at things like theologies of the child, for example, there's going to be a lot more trust on the part of certain ideas of theology of the child. Again, not that I agree with one or the other, but I think, you know, you can see that if you take a very positive view of the child, one, they're much more innocent than guilty, if you like, then I think that you're much more likely to create an environment where that child feels they're not going to get jumped on for saying a wrong answer. Whereas if you're much more Augustinian, which obviously some models of children ministry are, then I think those are going to provide more problematic environments for relational safety, because youth and
children. Froze you. You coming back?
I'm back.
Sorry.
All right. I'll just finish what I was saying, and then So, in my research, that was picked up because children and young people, both of them, like children as young as 8, right up to 18-year-olds, were very, very concerned about what adults thought about what they were saying, and they felt whenever they said something that it was being put out there for judgment, and not being judged was very, very key for them. So again, it's not me making a theological judgment, because I'm not, I'm probably more on the, as I said, on the Reformed evangelical side, but I can see the problems that causes when young people are being taught more than joined on a journey of discovery, and they feel like they might get their answer wrong all the time. So I can see how that would have issues. And again, that just reinforces my understanding that IG is something that finds more fertile ground in the less conservative areas of church. Yeah.
It's funny you keep saying that, and I totally understand where that's coming from, and yet within the less conservative churches, as the charismatic movement within Australia is actually the place where they are the most resistant to IG.
To the charismatic churches are. Yeah, and the less conservative ones.
Yeah, but the Pentecostal kind of charismatic spaces are the places where that is the no-go zone, whereas the much more, the more different, liberal, certainly it's
mainstream.
Mainstream. So it's a very interesting thing to watch, where that's not easy to have that conversation, and where even within our Anglican system, which would be one of our most, in some ways, conservative, are actually doing some really wonderful work in the area of IG.
Yeah. I think certainly. I mean, the churches I was looking at were quite small, so we weren't getting to the stage where you were getting like the church that you mentioned, Terry. You know, the kind of big grandstand kind of event. You know, it wasn't that sort of thing, and I can see
how that could.
And obviously, you've got things like the heavy shepherding movement within Pentecostalism, and also other areas of charismatic and Pentecostal theology, which cause problems for IG.
Yeah.
So that's definitely true.
Yeah.
And also the context is going to be very different. So Australia is obviously a very different place to the UK.
Yeah. Well, and we have lots of similarities too, which is really wonderful. So, it's just, it's been, what you've been able to share with us is just been really enlightening, and some really great key pieces there. Really appreciate that. And I look forward to... Is that you, Terry?
No. Oh.
Is that you with the birds?
Yeah, I'm out walking, trying to get some... Is it time for one more question?
Yes, of course, Terry.
Oh, I just wrote a piece this morning about hope. And so I'm wondering, Gareth, if Boris was able to develop a time machine and gave you one, and you got into it and got out 10 years into the future, what would you hope to find or see as a result of all that you are discovering and exploring? So what is your hope-filled picture for maybe a different future?
Oh my goodness, what a question. Oh, I feel anything I say is going to be so woefully kind of like inadequate.
No, this is your picture. This is your story. So we can't debate it or no, just anyway.
Well, given I've now pumped nearly 6 years of my life into this thesis and I'm actually coming out with something, I hope that, for what it's worth, some of the things I've started sharing with you, but also the pieces on relational safety and leadership are things that can be put into digestible form so that churches can, at least think about these things. What I want is people to be aware, I think, of the theology, either conservative or not, and the impact that they can have on their model of ministry, to help them be aware, so that, I think conservative churches have the ability I think I've got other resources that I didn't find in my research, but I know because I'm from that background. And I think they've got other resources that they could use for IG. And I think charismatic and less conservative churches have got loads as well. So I think what I'll be trying to help churches is to see that they've got resources within their traditions to foster both IG and family ministry at the home, both of those things. And to do so in a way that I think, it embraces a fully all biblical theology and the dynamism of children who, as they grow into the teenage years. That would be my hope. I need to make that way snappier, but thanks for the questions.
No, well, it's a big question to finish. Thanks, Terry, for your questions, and Gareth, for willing to share, which I know is in some ways probably challenging for you because there's unformed pieces for you that you're working on, so it's hard to jump in. But, I think conversation helps the process, and I really appreciate you willing to share, especially when the fact that it's 12 o'clock at night for you. And just really pray that for you guys in England that things start to get some kind of, what we call flattening the curve, that get some kind of answers, and that somehow we will get through this in a way that does bring hope, because God is the one that we trust at this time, and so it's our prayer for everyone and for families, to be really praying for families. Oh, you show off, Terry.
Sorry. 31 degrees today. Sorry, Gareth.
Yeah, it's about 1 here where I am.
Yeah, so God bless you. God bless everyone. I've just got his water bottle. God bless Zoom that allows us to have these conversations in such extreme different weathers. And I just do really pray for all of us that we have wisdom and a sense of your peace, God, as we continue to lead in this space. In Jesus' name, amen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. Thank you. Thanks,
thank you very much for your interaction and engagement.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can continue to connect. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Good night.
Good night. Good morning.
That's right.